Welcome to episode 204, Mastering the Art of Online Group Therapy, featuring Ariel Landrum, licensed marriage and family therapist. Make sure to subscribe to be alerted about future episodes by Clearly Clinical. Learn, grow, shine. Hello to our listeners. My name is Beth Irias, and I am just so happy to be joined again by Ariel Landrum. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She has joined us a couple of times in the past. And today we're going to be talking about groups via telehealth, which I can only speak for myself in saying that may be an intimidating process in terms of the management and setting the frame and the law and ethics stuff. Thank you so much for joining us again, Ariel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
So why don't you tell our listeners a bit about you and how you came to be so familiar with the telehealth process, particularly with groups?
Yes, absolutely. If you did watch some of those other episodes, you'll know that I had a contract with the Navy. And as soon as I got licensed in 2016, and part of the work involved telehealth sessions. And I did provide telehealth support groups for the active duty service members, as well as family members who were experiencing deployment for the first time. And for those who don't know, a support group is very different than a intrapersonal processing group. Interpersonal processing groups are often closed groups where they have a fixed set of members and they are run and facilitated by someone who is licensed. Support groups can be run by a peer support or those credentialed in counseling from a bachelor's level. And so they had me running and co-facilitating with a peer who was often a part of the community. So some for the support groups for those who were service members, it was someone who was also active duty, who was volunteering their time, or a chaplain. And then for the family members, it was often a seasoned family member or someone who was like an ombudsman to help explain the process of what deployment looks like. And so we would run those support groups online and using for their platform, Microsoft Teams. Everything's Microsoft if you work for the government. And really the focus of the groups were to create a safe space to talk about the common struggles of military life and answer some questions, which is why you needed a peer support there who might be more integrated.
Interesting. This actually beautifully transitions into just the topic of this conversation about the different kinds of groups that are out there. And maybe that's a perfect place for us to start. You already mentioned, like, what is a support group? What is peer support? Can you talk more about that? Because I think particularly for clinicians who haven't done groups yet, let alone doing them in person or online, it's hard to conceptualize all these different kinds, but really there are many different kinds of groups.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we have our common therapeutic groups, and they increase a member's self-awareness, and they're usually created to clarify challenges and provide tools for change. And so in those therapeutic groups, it might be one focused on those who have been diagnosed recently with cancer, or individuals who are surviving specific types of trauma or abuse. So they're therapeutic. They're usually facilitated by someone who is licensed. And then you have task groups. And this is a general group that anybody can join within an organization where a specific task is meant to be completed. So when you think of a team or a project, a community organization, those groups are usually facilitated by a leader in the organization. However, a clinician can usually help facilitate interpersonal experiences within those groups. So if there is in-group fighting, so to speak, if there's confusion on roles that need to be clarified, a clinician can help facilitate that conversation. Those are usually people with like an industrial organizational psychology background. And then you have psychoeducational groups. Those groups tend to be structured, closed, and they are specifically providing education on a specific mental health topic. It may include coping tools, it may include homework, it may include sheets, but these are specific groups like stress management or parenting classes or social skills groups. often facilitated by someone who's licensed, but could be include someone who is a peer. Because it's psychoeducation, they have to have someone who's licensed, but usually it's co-facilitated with a peer that can help provide additional examples. And sometimes a graduate of the program will come back and be the person that helps co-facilitate. Then you have your general counseling groups. And these counseling groups are meant to process and problem solve strategies that help members understand sort of interpersonal natures, but they're different than an intrapersonal processing group like our traditional YALM, because in those groups, the interpersonal work that's happening is only within the group. And they're trying to resolve very specific issues that occur in the here and now. In counseling groups, we might be discussing specific issues like grief and loss or recovery. And so there will be interpersonal experiences amongst each other when we're talking about the struggle that we're having with grief and loss or the struggle we're having with recovery. People have different experiences in those realms. However, the counseling that's usually occurring is to facilitate a very specific change or a very specific coping tool. So the facilitator is often interjecting to create structure, and there are usually activities involved. We find these counseling groups also like in student centers. So you'll see a lot of counseling groups on campuses and colleges, especially around the time when there is exams or a lot of stress. This is usually when we see them utilized the most. And some campuses or colleges will have them closed, some will have them opened.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. You had mentioned the word closed and then open. Can you describe a little bit more about what that means for people who aren't familiar with that phrasing?
Absolutely. A closed group means that it is fixed membership. That means you oftentimes interview or have an intake with each potential person, and you as a facilitator are going to assess if they would create good group dynamics. And by good group dynamics is that there's a balance, there might be diversity, that they are there to work on whatever the specific change they want to work on. So the purpose of the group, that they have a desire for membership. An open group means that the individuals can come in and out. They may not follow the whole group structure. They may not attend from beginning to end. It may not even have a structured end. And what I mean by that is support groups generally are same time, same day, but they aren't for 12 weeks or for 6 months. They are instead just open. You will see this a lot in recovery, a lot of AA groups. There's even online a AA group that's 24/7 that you can just jump in through their telehealth Zoom to be able to get that support whenever you need it. And those are often facilitated by peers within the community. And so open groups have a different type of structure. There is often the session is starting with the group norms and rules and talking about confidentiality. Although you do that with closed groups as well, you might make that reminder or talk about confidentiality when something might come up that looks like confidentiality might be broken. In reality, you are doing it all the time with an open group because you have new members every day. And your members are also mixed in that some may be very seasoned and have heard this conversation a million times. Some, this is their very first time. And so you're helping facilitate the balance of trying to get new individuals to have conversations and integrate themselves while seasoned individuals stay interested and not feel like they're getting regurgitated information.
Interesting. Thank you. And I realized as I asked that question, were there any other group types that you didn't get to name while we were talking?
Yeah, the last one would be a brief group therapy. Brief group therapy is usually solution focused treatment, and that is often a closed group. And that often has a very specific amount of sessions and may even include individuals who are mandated. And so oftentimes mandated groups have a facilitator that is licensed. There may also be a co-facilitator that's a peer or co-facilitator who is an associate. However, it is brief because it is solution-focused thinking, usually structured, has regular tasks that they need to accomplish, like a theme for each session, and even like sign-in sheets that get reported to maybe like a PO or to a judge.
Got it. Thank you. And before we move on, can you name all of those again, just to remind our listeners of all these different group types?
Absolutely. A therapeutic group, a task group, a psychoeducational group, a counseling group, a psychotherapy group, and a brief group therapy. And a therapeutic group could be an intrapersonal processing group, which is a very traditional form of group therapy.
Do you find that these terms are misused?
Yes, the terms are often misused. In fact, there are a lot of individuals who advertise group therapy, and technically it's a support group. Simply because, again, the way that group therapy has been defined in most of the literature and research, it's been defined in the way that Irvin Yalom has defined it,
Yeah.
which is a closed group with a licensed professional, and in the here and now, not structured in the way where we're bringing up the topics as the facilitator. And so, like a cognitive behavioral focused group on anxiety, for example, would not be an interpersonal processing group because the facilitator is directing and leading more of the experience.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Whew. So when we're taking this in mind, knowing that for the purpose of today's conversation, a clinician of some sort, whether pre-licensed or licensed, so looking typically less toward support group, more toward psychoeducation or process, if you will, the whole idea of taking that online is quite the undertaking. Where do we start, Ariel, as someone who's done this for so many years? Like, how do you even start to conceptualize a group? And then I have so many questions about the legal and ethical impact here about, like, well, what if a client is in another state when you're doing the group every week and yada, yada?
Absolutely. So, the first thing we want to understand is that an online group of any kind involves recognizing it's just a digital adaptation of a traditional group. So, the participants are still going to receive psychological support, they're still going to receive intervention. It's just in an online format. And that compared to in person, there's still benefits that they have access to. It's the challenges that we face that are different. So things that are unique to an online format is that obviously we're going to have difficulty observing a full body nonverbal cue. We have to pay very close attention to really face and shoulders, and the nuances of seeing an eye dart to the side of the screen and what that could mean. We obviously have to experience technical glitches, something that's not going to happen in person. People aren't exactly glitching out in front of you. And so for the most part, you are wanting to be well educated on the platform you're using, and you want to give tools to the members on how to troubleshoot. And you have to have a conversation about what will happen if someone's feed drops out. I also would say that depending on where you live, you might have more canceled group sessions if there is thunderstorms happening, or obviously if there is a hurricane or tornado warning, like that would be already integrated in how you ran your therapy sessions in person. So it would be easy to have that integration online. You're going to have really understanding of what virtual engagement means, like what you're going to have to do virtually that's very different than in person. And that you are going to have people joining in diverse environments. And so you're going to have to really focus on privacy and confidentiality and how to help them get to those aspects. And something, again, that you're not going to experience in person is screen fatigue. So you have to be really mindful of your group size and length. Having somebody sit in a group that's longer than 60 minutes might be cause some fatigue if they are not used to it. If you're running a group for gamers, that they're probably not going to have as much screen fatigue. If you're running a support group for the aging community, they might not be used to staring at a screen, at a computer as long or as often. Or maybe they do, like for their TV, but they're in their comfy chair and this is not their comfy chair, right? So you would have to just be cognizant of those things. However, when it comes to in-person and online groups, you're still undergoing like the stages of change, just like you would a group. You are still talking about confidentiality and privacy. You're still, as a facilitator, guiding discussions and managing group dynamics, and you are still building a therapeutic alliance. So you want to remember that those are the things that are essential for group dynamics in person or online.
Got it. Thank you. That was a really important point about screen fatigue and just the lived experience being different. I'm thinking back to my in-person group experience, and everyone has a different way of doing this, but it's like, how do we make sure that people don't get distracted by technology? Is there a basket near the door where you put your phones and we make sure they're on silent or whatever it is? It's a whole different ball game when we're talking about telehealth.
Yes.
So knowing that there are so many aspects, let's first start at the beginning in terms of finding participants for telehealth, screening participants for telehealth, if we're looking at this through the lens of best practice.
So obviously you can advertise online, you can network with other clinicians that you know. And so finding participants probably means that if you are going to if you've decided the group is all online versus hybrid, so that's sort of its own conversation. If it's all online, then you want to do your intake and interview online. You want to see how someone is able to join the video platform, run them through how to test their bandwidth to see if they have enough connectivity. And then there's like an ideal number that you want to hit for input and output for your bandwidth when you're running a group. And you want to decide how large the group needs to be. And that's going to depend on the bandwidth as well as the purpose, obviously, of the group. I tend to run groups that are open support groups that can have an upwards of 40 people attending. And they are support groups. We are sharing, we are having a conversation around a specific topic. They are often affinity groups where individuals have to be aligned with the membership of the community we're supporting. For me, they are AANHPI, so Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander groups. So the person has to identify as being in that diaspora or pan-ethnic identity, whichever term you want to use. We talk about the experience of being in that identity. So in those support groups, I'm not providing mental health services in the way where I'm intervening a specific form of change. Instead, the group members are creating change with each other through the conversations that are happening. And so that's not going to involve me doing a lot of intaking. However, with my closed groups, my groups for survivors of childhood sexual abuse, I'm doing a lot of assessing for group fit. I'm doing a lot of assessing for technology fit. And I'm doing a lot of assessing around time, just like you would in person, to see what is the right time for individuals to meet. So for my survivors group, a lot of them are around the same age range, but they were all in school and they had different school schedules. I kind of had to make a decision of what could be the most best fit. And if people weren't able to attend that one, then I would just have to try and create another one if it was possible. Otherwise, I'd refer them to another group somewhere else.
Got it. Thank you. You had mentioned the bandwidth piece. Let's talk for a minute about technology to be able to pull this off. I know as we're recording this in 2024, it's still fresh in my mind of this, whoa, hurry up that happened in early 2020 when everything needed to go online. And now I think many clinicians are still kind of playing catch up of like, oh, here are the systems that we had been using. Here are more ideal systems. Can you speak a bit about what we need to be thinking as practitioners to actually be able to support a group in terms of our internet, our privacy, what kind of resource we're using, documentation, HIPAA, all that fun stuff?
Absolutely. So when it comes to the technology, you want to make sure that your video conferencing software, if it is a video, there are some people who do run groups audio only, so that's a consideration. But if it is a video and audio and it's synchronous at the same time, which groups usually are, then you want to make sure that it's HIPAA compliant. And the only way that you're going to know that is if the system that you're using either signs a BAA, or if you are, using a system of an organization that you're working with that has a little security symbol. It's usually shaped like a shield. You're going to see that like with Zoom, same with Teams, and what your level of controls are. So your level of controls are, can you prevent people from screen sharing or recording? Are you the only person who can do that? Do you have control of the chat? One of the things we notice in in-person groups all the time is people have side chatter, and we have to sort of like call it out. When you don't have control of the chat, people can have private conversations with each other that you aren't aware of. And so now we've made a subgroup within the group, and that can really affect group dynamics, especially in a closed group where people are returning. And so you have to have a conversation with, if you have access to the chat. When we close this Zoom meeting, for example, I will have access to the chat. I will know if there were private conversations. And part of our group norms is that we will bring that up. So I will bring that up in the next session. You want to be very clear on the norms and the expectations of the group, and that you are going to bring things to light, not in a shaming or blaming way, but to help increase awareness of why this conversation occurred privately. Was there a lack of comfort? Have we not created a safe enough space in the group? Was there a fear around judgment, right? Like those are the things that usually we're working on. So we want to sort of bring that to light. But we would have to let the people know that's happening. That's part of our informed consent, right? Other forms of technology that we have to be considerate about is if we have an activity group. Are we, when we're screen sharing, what exactly they can see on the screen? These are kind of things that we know, right? But if we're doing a whiteboard and we're letting everybody engage in the digital whiteboard, maybe it's a child's group and we're doing an art activity, and we're like drawing symbols for what the group represents today, right? Like we want to create our own symbol. We have to be aware that we can see the names of the individuals drawing. Unless we told everyone they have to change their name. Now, this is where there's a difference between support group and closed groups. Closed groups, we tend to know who everybody is. We are trying to have a relationship. Support groups, we might decide that we wanted to keep it as confidential as possible because it is drop-in and we want everyone to change their name. There is no set rule, however, because again, in person, people don't come in with a pseudonym. Although I have seen a lot of facilitators demand and expect for anonymity that you create a fake name when you log in, that you type in putting in what your fake name is for that day. And whatever those modalities are that are preventing them for that transparency, that's on them. But the way that I run groups, people are coming in with their name. Like we can see who they are. We're using their name. We're addressing them by that name. The other component, so we can see those names of individuals drawing on the whiteboard, but we also, just like in regular in-person group, someone might write something dirty. We're going to have to address that. We're going to have a conversation of that. And if we're working with kids, another parent might be walking in to check on their kid and see this dirty word written in their group setting, right? That's not something that might have happened in person because the parent isn't coming in and out of the room. However, the child's in their private space and the parent is going to be there. So you have to be prepared to have conversations not only in the intake process for the individual, but if it's someone who is under 18 with who's ever consenting for their treatment, about some of the things that might be experienced so that there's a lot of prep work.
Thank you. You're covering so many important points that I think are really valuable to think about because there are so many different variables. Going back to something Ariel said when talking about privacy, she mentioned the acronym BAA. For folks who don't know, that stands for Business Associate Agreement. And what that is an agreement between you and another person or entity basically saying that they're going to protect the client protected health information as if it were their own, essentially. And what I mean by that is as if it were their client. So it's an agreement to protect client privacy and confidentiality. So let's say that we have an identified topic. We're not doing a support group. We're doing a closed group that's facilitated by one single clinician. I imagine doing informed consent in a closed group is much easier than doing informed consent with an open group. Can you speak a little bit about that? Do you personally rely on forms? Do you go through the limits of confidentiality every time in an open group? Can you speak about that? Because that is a different detail, which again, I mean, it would happen same if you were doing it in person, but making sure that everybody who's in that space at that moment understands the consequence of what they're sharing and what can be shared outside that group.
Absolutely. So when it comes to confidentiality, in an open group, I am going to share it at the beginning every single time. I include that confidentiality means that the group isn't being recorded and that we aren't attempting to record or screenshot it. And that when we share about our experiences in group, we're sharing what we learned. We're not sharing someone else's story because that belongs to them. And we don't want other people to share our story because it belongs to us. And I usually give an example as part of my informed consent. So if you were really moved by, in this grief group, someone finding acceptance and making meaning of the loss that they recently experienced, you aren't sharing their name and their loss. You're sharing that you learned that you could make meaning around a loss. So I'd give like a very definitive example because people do want to share the things that they've learned. I don't know how many videos I've seen, like my therapist taught me this, my therapist said that online, lots of self-disclosing. And so you can say, in my group, I learned this, in my group, I learned that. You don't have to share someone's specific story and their name. In a closed group, we have this conversation in the beginning. We'll bring it up throughout, but it isn't as detailed. There isn't as much time spent in the beginning giving those examples because we've sort of integrated that understanding and learning, and we've built that level of trust, or we should have. If the group goes awry, then that's on me, and I have to have a separate conversation around that. But in an open group where people are dropping in and out, I'm going to constantly have that conversation to create that level of safety, to say that this is a safe space to be able to be vulnerable because we are keeping it in this space. And I do use that word space, that we have all collectively decided to join this virtual room. And sometimes I will even create the semblance of space in Zoom. When you have it in gallery mode, you can actually click on each individual's image and move the tile. So I tell people to copy the format that mine is in, and I will say each person's name, and they will move the tiles around. And so now we all have the same screen format. And it sort of gives this representation of us all being in the same space together because we had this intentionality of putting people in certain places. Now, I know with Microsoft Teams, you can actually put people in seats in like a virtual theater or room. And I know Zoom has sort of added that feature if you want to play around with those things to sort of emulate as much as you can being in the same space. Sometimes if we have a theme of the day, especially for grief groups when I'm doing like pet loss, because I work with a lot of people who have ESAs. Eventually, sometimes the ESAs pass away or something tragic happens. We might start our group off with our background image of our animal. And that is us sort of joining together that we are here. Or for kids groups, we might pretend that we are under the sea. We might all have the same virtual background to feel like we're under the sea. And that gives that feeling of joining, of togetherness, of intentionality for the group.
Thank you. You bring up another point that I think is potentially complicated about telehealth groups. The boundaries and expectations are very different. You know, if we're in an in-person group, you probably can't join the group while you're driving.
No.
But you can if you're doing telehealth, or the issue of clothing, hygiene, drinking alcohol, using substances. These are all things that come up during telehealth groups. Can you speak a little bit about that, knowing that clinicians can't possibly anticipate everything unique that might come up in session where you go, didn't see that one coming. But can you bring up some of those ideas of like, yeah, here's some of the things that you might want to talk about when you're setting the frame for the group?
Absolutely. So I always say that in the beginning of each group that we're here together and we're here stationary. There's no driving. You can join in your car parked somewhere if that is the only time you're able to join, and you don't want to miss the group. Some clinicians, again, it sort of depends on your theory. Some may say that no, you have to be in your personal space that you join in every single time to have a semblance of routine. For me, however, if you are trying to make the effort to join, then I will let you in, as long as you are stationary. And I have had people who have joined while they're driving, and I've had to excuse them from the group and say, hey, this is a safety issue. And I know that you really want to listen in. However, I can't just have you listen in. It wouldn't be fair for you if you really wanted to participate and share and you can't because you're driving, or that you try to, and we are very fearful for your safety. Now we're no longer focusing on the group. We're focusing on you and your safety. So I shifted to, this is no longer a group experience. This is a group worrying about one individual, and we can't provide aid. With parents, I let them know they do have to be home They can't leave their kiddo alone. I'm virtual. I'm not a babysitter. And the problem is it might be easy because you're used to sitting your child maybe in front of a screen for a few hours. That might be your parenting style. No judgment there. However, if an earthquake happens, I can't do anything for your kiddo. And I always use that as an example because I do live in California. However, for my clients, because I'm licensed in multiple states, for my clients in Kansas, I use the example of a tornado. For my clients in Oregon, I'm going to use like heavy rains and flooding. So those are the ways that I talk about emergency, even though part of me is also thinking of emergency of risk of safety if someone is attempting to hurt themselves or someone else. With children, I want someone to be home. With an adult, we always have an emergency plan. And with my open groups, that may not be as possible. I may not have an emergency plan right away if it's an open group that you can sort of drop in. So I do talk about in the beginning, if someone is feeling unsafe, I might reach out to you directly. I might message you directly in the chat, or I might reach out to you after the group is closed because of a level of concern, because I don't have an emergency procedure set in place. And that is the risk that I'm taking as a clinician in order to do support group. And most of the support groups I'm doing are ones that are designed for survivors or designed for grief and loss. And so there's less likely that risk is happening, but there's always a potential for risk. When it comes to recovery, that is its own unique experience. Each agency has a conversation about whether they will let someone join if they are intoxicated or appear inebriated. And that happens to be a common struggle I've seen a lot of fellow colleagues run into, is that someone is joining and they're actively using, or they're trying to use on camera. So they'll have to like close them out or kick them out of the group, essentially kick out of the group. And then they have to have a conversation of the consequence of that. The clients know that they aren't supposed to, and it's part of the recovery process that there's relapse. So it really depends on the theory of the individual and the way that they work with recovery, whether that is quote unquote allowable or not.
Thank you. I'm sure clinicians listening have these examples coming to mind. Certainly toward the beginning of the pandemic, the examples of people standing up and not wearing any pants, or taking the phone or computer into the bathroom thinking they've muted. These are interesting things that we don't typically talk about with in-person therapy. Like you don't have a whole group and you're like, okay, I need to go wash my hands. Let's all go. Like, it's different.
It is definitely different, and you can certainly use it to some of your advantage. Like I have clients that will share the altars of the individuals that have passed that they've created in their home. They will bring us around those spaces. So one of the things that I've noticed with supervising clinicians who are working telehealth is that because the virtual space involves observing somebody in their like intimate setting, there is this struggle to be able to call out when we see nonverbal cues of lack of participation that they wouldn't feel in person. And that's because we are seeing someone in their private space. So I have to give my supervisees language, saying things like, I've noticed some of us might be juggling different tasks. It's important for group cohesion that we are here and we are present. If there's something urgent, can you let me know and let the group know so that we can give you the time and space to deal with that urgent thing? And we will know when someone isn't paying attention online. We just will. We will see the screen light change because they've switched screens to look at something. We will see their eyes darting back and forth as if they're reading or watching something. So it's not difficult to tell when someone has disconnected emotionally or physically. It's the fact that we feel like we're judging and interfering when we're calling it out, versus in person, when someone is distracted, we invite that conversation in the group. It's not as a feeling of shame, but because we can see their personal lives behind them, there's this sense that we are somehow impeding and we have disrupted or highlighted imbalance versus, again, inviting it as part of the process. And if, again, we don't want to, quote unquote, call someone out directly, inviting it to the whole group process of it can be easy to get distractions. Some of us might have Slack notifications going off that it's hard to ignore. How do we make ourselves present? What do we do for boundaries for this space?
Thank you for that. There's so many variables that we can't anticipate. And I think your point is a good one about considering effectively the tone of the group. I'm thinking about groups that are facilitated with new parents that are trying to meet the needs of their infant while they're having a group, that it's like, what might be acceptable in that group to step out when XYZ child issue happens is different than if we're doing like a substance recovery group. When it comes to engaging people, as you said, generally we can tell via pretty subtle cues if somebody is disengaged. If their eyes, as you said, keep darting to a certain direction on the screen, things like that. Can you speak more about how you do that in terms of, what is effectively calling it out, but not wanting to put somebody on blast, so to speak?
Yeah, so I may privately message that individual. I may say, hey, I think some of us are having some troubles being able to stay present. It seems like we're working on other tasks. I'll say, like, let's put our hands up in the air for a moment and just do a deep breath. Maybe like do a mindfulness prompt. It may be that if it's someone who has been doing it repeatedly, I may invite the group to have a conversation around this. Hey, it seems like we have allowed someone to be able to work on multiple tasks, and we're giving them permission. Is there a reason that this individual has been given that permission? And usually there is a conversation around that. For my group, sometimes it is that someone has said right away, hey, I'm waiting for a phone call for this. And then the next time it's, I have to make sure that I leave my notifications on for this. Becomes a repeat pattern. It may be a conversation with that individual one-on-one around whether this group time is a good one for them, a good fit, or if I should refer them to another group, or if I should refer them to individual. If life has been really chaotic, group may not be the best support tool and they might need more individual focused attention. And I always bring it from the framework of our needs are different. And if our needs are different, then how can we support each other and make sure that this space is equitable?
Thank you. I appreciate that explanation. When you have different levels of engagement, I'm thinking about groups that I've facilitated with court mandated teens and, like the hoodie pulled up and the body language, it says very clearly, I don't want to be here. That's a different thing when you're sitting in a little circle that's 12 feet across versus when you're virtual. Ask anybody who is taught online. It can be really difficult to get people engaged. Can you give our listeners some tips and tricks about how to get people from checking out? Because I think it's a lot easier online.
When I have closed groups, it's I would say that it's tailored. And so I might start the group sessions off where I say, like, hey, I'm going to have everybody turn off their camera and turn off their mic. And I want you to respond with emojis in the chat to get them comfortable with the virtual format and to have already created a time and space where it was allowable for them to, quote unquote, hide themselves. And then I'll say, okay, now that we've done that for 10 minutes, we're going to transition to just mics on. And maybe I'll do a breathing exercise first. We're going to hear each other breathe. And then we'll have that conversation and switch with, you can still respond with emojis in the chat, but you can also start to talk. Right. And then we might end with cameras on. So we're doing that slow buildup, especially with my anxiety groups. They need that slow buildup. They need to be able to start to feel comfortable with the format. For my open groups, I may have some people that join with their camera on, some with their camera off, but their mic on, some with no camera on, no mic. And that is part of the fact that it is people sort of dropping in. And so I actually make all of those dynamics allowable. And I say, hey, this is a conversation and we do want everyone to engage, but we want you to engage in the way you feel comfortable. So if you want your camera on, we would love to see your face. If you want your camera off, we would love to hear you participate in the chat. Or to use the emojis. And I will call out when something has happened. And what I mean by that is if someone is shared really vulnerably, I will say, hey, can we show this group member support right now because they've been very open and vulnerable? Can you use some of the reactions in Zoom, or can you use some of the emojis in the chat, or can you respond with what you're thinking and feeling in the chat? So it's a little more diverse in the way the interaction is because it's open. Now, I do know some facilitators who they will have open groups, and it is an expectation rule that you have your camera on and your mic off mute, and that can be a lot of pulling. I would say I've seen some facilitators really struggle. And then I've seen some where they have created a very specific type of support group that everyone is aware of, and they already follow that rule. So I think some of the struggles you're going to experience are just the struggles that you would experience in person. If you've always had problems with trying to get people engaged, then that might be you learning how to create more opportunity for engagement.
Thank you. One of the things I was thinking about while you were talking was going back to law and ethics side of things, the difficulty for you as a clinician, if you're leading a quote unquote support group and your obligation to the I was going to say client, but really participant being different than if you're leading a formal therapy group. Can you speak a bit about that? And also that piece of the client's location? Because I think for many of us, we're so used to thinking of therapy in terms of individual, and this whole idea of group therapy of like, okay, if it's a support group, then you could have clients smattered all over the United States, and it's not therapy. But if it's therapy and you're only licensed in Nevada, then the clients need to be in Nevada. Can you elaborate on that and kind of those considerations that we might otherwise miss because there are just so many variables?
Yeah. So again, usually it has to do more with it if it's a closed or open group. That's kind of the hint. But if you have decided that you only want to work with individuals that are in the state that you're licensed in because you need to keep very detailed group notes. So mandated groups are probably going to be an example. Recovery groups, if you work at an agency, those are already sort of like a fixed population. And you do have to write very detailed notes. You may have to write notes that are like representative of each individual's experience. And it's interesting, some states have different laws around whether group therapy notes are considered therapy notes that are confidential or not. In the state of California, they are. They are considered part of therapy and they are confidential. There are other states where they are not considered part of actual therapy. And so they could be sort of subpoenaed. You would know that if you're licensed in those states, but at least in California, that we see group therapy as therapy. And so in those cases, you are going to put in your informed consent that not only are you stationary, you're not driving, but also you have to be within the state. If you join in group and you are in a location that I don't recognize, I'm going to ask. And if you are joining in from another state that I'm not licensed in, then I can't have you in the group session because this is group therapy. This isn't a support group. Now, with a support group, you are going to have a lot of people, especially if it's an open support group, you're going to have a lot of people coming in from really all over. I've had even some people come internationally. And I am not really taking group notes. I'm not writing down individuals' names because it is not repeated. Sometimes it is just about one specific topic for that day. Sometimes it's an ongoing support group. And in those cases, I have a conversation around, again, that emergency and safety. I try to have people share in the chat at least where they're joining in from, so usually state or country. And I will message somebody directly if I feel that there is a level of distress or concern that they're presenting that I need to try and intervene. However, again, that's a risk I've decided to take to be able to provide that support group. And I know that the individuals who run the 24-hour Zoom group for AA, again, a risk they're taking, and some of them are even peer support. So they don't have the trained facilitation. And you have to decide for yourself and your practice where you feel comfortable. Now, when it comes to insurance, my malpractice insurance does cover me for the support groups. They do cover me for providing aid because I'm an expert as a clinician, even though I'm not providing therapy. And so if there were something to happen, I know that they have my back.
That was a very important point. Thank you for bringing up that piece again, because there's so many details. It's hard for us to remember all of them. Thank you for coming and speaking about some of the most important ones. When it comes to your experience, having done this for such a long time, can you share some of the tricky moments that you've dealt with? Of course, protecting client privacy, but just some of those things that maybe you didn't anticipate and now they've become valuable learning experiences.
Yeah, so I would say again for me it was working with the military. I had some cases where people were getting ready for their shift and they were cleaning a firearm on screen, and those are normalized. That's a normal experience for that environment. But for me as a clinician, even though I was raised by a military dad, I I had acute awareness that this was happening. And I had so many things running in my mind. I was like, is this intimidating the group? Is anyone like thinking that they're unsafe? What if this person says that they're unsafe? What if they do something on camera that could cause harm? Or what if they have an accident? Maybe it's not even intentional in any way, but they accidentally shoot the firearm off. Like I had all of these things in my head, and it wasn't part of the briefing that was given to me. I wasn't told that this could be a potential thing that could happen. And so and so I had a conversation with my supervisor at the time. Even though I was licensed, we had supervisors, always consult, always speak to a supervisor. And I asked, is this normal behavior I should expect? And my supervisor said, no, you can say that, hey, I would prefer that you do that in the on your own time. I don't, and really not highlighting it as a shame or safety issue, but instead highlighting it as a participation issue. Hey, I want to make sure that you're fully integrated into what we're saying and what we're doing. If you need something to fiddle with your hands, like if you are somebody who needs to move around to stretch, we can talk about a group norm around that. Maybe we have a break and we stretch every once in a while, or maybe we allow people to have sort of like fidget objects. But to clean your gun is you instead using this time to do work, because that is your job. That is a function of your job. So you aren't here fully present. Instead, you are utilizing this as pseudo time to be able to play catch up. And that was a conversation I had with the group member individually, and something that I then integrated into my introduction process, into my informed consent, and into the first group explanation of the norms. And nothing ever happened, thank goodness. But that would have never come into my framework at all. I would have never thought that I would be seeing someone engaging with their firearm on screen. And yet I again was raised in the military. I've certainly been in people's houses where they've had cabinets where they have been prepping things together, and they're getting things ready to return to the arms. So I hadn't thought about that in the sense of what it would look like in a group structure.
Thank you. Thank you for that example. I would imagine for you, you probably have then a form that you're looking at on the screen when you're covering that. I don't even necessarily call it informed consent, because informed consent applies specifically to this provision of therapy, which is different than a support group. So do you call it like boundaries or expectations? Like, what do you call it when we're not looking at the closed group of formal therapy? What is it over here?
So it's usually called like group norms and expectations. And it is still considered, if it is a actual traditional group therapy where you're using your license and representing yourself as a therapist, it is part of your informed consent. And in this case, it would be like a professional disclosure if it was just a support group. And that's usually included in the advertising, as well as, again, that first session, I might share my screen with a document of the group norms. And again, also depends on your theory. So some people like to create group rules and norms at the first of a closed session together. So they might bring up the digital whiteboard, or they might bring up a document and start typing into it and say, what do you think our group norms should be? And so some people might say, we want people to virtually raise their hand, or like raise their hand physically. We don't want people to interject naturally, or we want a bathroom break at a certain time, or we want the opportunity to be able to be outside. right? So that is a conversation that can happen in that first session, and is usually part of some group facilitators' theories to create that joining experience. We're collaborating together. For my drop-in support groups, there isn't really time for that. So I do have like a expected structure of what joining the group is. When someone registers, they're going to get that emailed to them as well prior. So they will have already been somewhat informed. And I do have, again, like people who repeat come to those support groups. And so they have an understanding and they like to also share and interject. And in those cases, I will invite like, hey, is there anything that I missed? And people who have been here before, could you remind me, right? To help create and uplift those who have been returners and are also learning and growing.
Very helpful. Thank you for that. Going back to, I won't say missteps, but just kind of quirky experiences that you had. Are there any other that come to mind where you're like, oh, this was a valuable experience because I learned XYZ?
Yeah, so it would be again working with children. I do have a lot of situations where siblings will try and join in, or they had a play friend come over and they forgot. Everyone forgot that they were supposed to be in group and they want to invite that individual in. In those cases, if it's a support group, it's very different because, again, it's drop in and I'm not providing therapy. If it is a closed group, I can't invite that other individual in, especially if they're a kid, because I don't have consent forms signed. Additionally, I don't know if the rest of the group is comfortable with a random person joining in. Now, rarely has it been a very big issue. In the sense that the individual usually understands or the parent understands and they just excuse themselves from the group that day. And I might follow up with them and have a one-on-one conversation because they may have had feelings about being removed from the group when they really tried to show up. In the drop-in support groups, however, I haven't had really anyone say that they were uncomfortable with that experience. And then some people may also invite another family member or friend in. And again, it's because of the topics that we're having conversations around.
Thank you. With your experience having facilitated lots of groups, as you mentioned, kind of the standard structured therapy group a la Dr. Irv Yalom, what are some of the key lessons that you think are really important for therapists to keep in mind in this transition to online group work?
Yeah, I think when it comes to that here and now interaction, you are going to have a lot of here and now experiences that are individual to each group member because they are in their private personal space. You might hear them say like, oh, I don't know if anyone can hear my dog barking, right? And that might shift or change the tone of the group. I don't think so differently. Like in person, someone might say like, does anyone else hear that? Right? Like that is not uncommon. It really goes back to you how a facilitator is going to address that. Is that to you something that is meant to be processed? Or is that just a comment that was made? And depending on how you view it is how it might get responded to. And so if someone says, hey, can anyone hear the gardener in the background? It's really driving me nuts. We might have a conversation around, hey, does anyone else struggle with being present in this group? And what have they done to create that presence, right? Or is it, no, you're fine, we can't hear it. You have to kind of decide for yourself as a facilitator how you talk about that here and now experience. There are some cases where we just say, no, it's fine, because the person's genuinely worried about that noise or feel embarrassed, right? There are other times where we do use it as a seed for the topic of the day of being easily distracted, feeling fragmented focus, having difficulty with work-life balance. I only carved out an hour and I can't even get that, and just expressing those frustrations.
Got it. Thank you. When thinking about someone who has experience, let's say facilitating group therapy, and then the challenges associated with going online, I'm even thinking about it for myself, and it like gives me the heebie-jeebies. Like, what am I going to do with the chat? Like, what if somebody joins and their screen is dark and I don't want to call them out in front of everybody, but we agreed that these cameras are going to be on? Like, I can already see myself like feeling overwhelmed. How do you recommend clinicians get into this? Like, is it co-facilitating with someone who's more experienced? Like, kind of what are the best ways to dip our toe in slowly, because it is such a different format?
Yeah, so Again, I think also it goes back to your own methodology and your experience. I am very much into you joining the client and I'm very much into being authentic. So if I see a good number of people that have their camera off, I might just say, hey, it looks like everybody is feeling less comfortable about being seen today. So if we don't want to be seen, can we be heard? Right. So I might shift it like that. Let's all turn our cameras off and let's hear each other. Let's really hear each other. Let's hear and comment on the things we hear. Do we hear someone breathing heavily? Do we hear someone sighing? Well, what do we hear today? Right? I might invite that in. I might make it allowable and okay. Co-facilitation, I absolutely agree 100% when it comes to groups, especially if you're getting more like larger than 8. You want a facilitator with you to help support if someone needs a breakout room. For example, just like in person, if someone is being really triggered and they need a private moment, you might walk away with them and have the facilitator support them. In this case, you can put them in a breakout room with that facilitator. They might need that quiet moment and space. Or if your software doesn't allow for you to do a breakout, you might have the two of them log off and join on another account on another screen, and have maybe messaging internally like Slack or Discord or whatever you're using in your agency to find out what they're doing, because they don't have that. I think most software now has the ability to do a breakout and you can choose who they're in, but I'm not 100% sure on all software that everyone's using. Like, I don't know if Doxy.me has that capability or not. And I know clinicians are still using that. I also think if you're wanting to step into this, actually what would be easier to do is to do a closed group than a open group, simply because an open one has lots more surprises and you're having to really think on the spot. And if that scares you, if you're not comfortable with that, if you think that's out of your scope, a closed group is going to be a relationship that you've developed with these individuals. You've already done an intake with them to ensure group fit. You've already assessed things like if the time is right, if they know what they're working on, if they understand the expectations. You've had them sign paperwork. You might feel more comfortable, and because you have a little bit more control. And again, goes back to your theory. If you are someone who's non-directive, very person-centered, you may feel more comfortable with a support group. You may not like the idea of having to be so structured, of having to come up with a topic or a theme specifically, or to have to keep re-engaging deeply into a matter that's interpersonal. You may be someone who really thrives on coming up with activities in the moment. You may be someone who likes the diversity of an open format that is a support group.
I know for me, this has been so valuable, Ariel, because you've covered so many points that I don't think I would think of otherwise. So thank you for coming on and sharing some of your experience and expertise. For therapists who are wanting to learn more about transitioning to online groups, or they're already doing them and they want to develop that skill set, what's the best way to do that? Like, what resources do you recommend?
I really like, if again, Yalom is the father of group therapy, but I really like Groups, Process, and Practice by Corey. So I'm assuming they're all related. That is a textbook. However, they do have a section on telehealth, and they do talk about the various types of groups. They are very diverse. They always, in every chapter, talk about being aware of diversity and being aware of multicultural experiences and how to develop a group that isn't just homogenous so that you can really learn from each other. And especially if you're doing open groups that are support groups, you're going to have a lot of diversity. I think that has been a really wonderful textbook. And it's not that big. It's not that thick at all. And all of you have probably been trained on intrapersonal, and at least in school, because Yalom is the founder of group therapy. We call him the grandfather. But if you are wanting more digital format, if you're wanting to be more structured, if you're wanting some ideas on activities, I think this book is a really good one.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ariel. And for our listeners who want to learn more about you in particular and about your work, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so you can find me at guidancett.com. Again, that is guidancett.com. That is my private practice. You can also find Guidance Teletherapy on Instagram. And then you can find me personally on Instagram as Ariel3000.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It has been lovely to have you again and just share information, like I said, that I think many of us may not have thought about in terms of setting the frame, theory, method. So helpful. Again, for our listeners, Ariel Landrum, licensed marriage and family therapist. Please check out her website. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
You've just finished listening to another exclusive continuing ed podcast by Clearly Clinical. If you like what you just heard and you need continuing ed credits, please visit us at clearlyclinical.com to check out our one-year membership, where you'll have access to our growing library of continuing ed podcast courses. Clearly Clinical, where our goal is to help you learn, grow, and shine.